commitment to the two this will only increase the chances for similar escalation in the future. We believe that every effort should be made to create conducive conditions for resumption of talks between Israel and Palestine. In conclusion, I reiterate India's strong support to the just Palestinian cause and its unwavering solution.
Who, for the
thank you,
third
Mr.
time
President.
this week, has given us an extremely enlightening briefing on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories.
India for his
I
statement.
also thank him for all his efforts to halt the current violence in Palestine. I should also like to thank the Secretary General for his tireless efforts.
Thank you,
and
President.
for his participation in today's
I
meeting.
thank the Special Coordinator, Mr. Torwan
I
Island,
also welcome the presence
for the
of
third
the
time
distinguished
this week
ministers
has
and
given
representatives of the countries
an
concerned
extremely
by this
enlightening
crisis.
briefing on
Present
the
situation in the occupied
From
Palestinian
one
territories.
session and meeting to another,
I also
the
thank him
news
for all his
reaching us
efforts
from
to halt the occupied Palestinian territory.
Palestine.
I should also like to
edging
thank the Secretary
further
General
and
further away
for his
from
tireless
peace
efforts
perspectives and for his
pursuant to the
participation
consensus
of the
today's
international
meeting.
community on the creation of
I
a
also
Palestinian
welcome the
state
presence
living
of
alongside
distinguished
Israel
ministers
in
and
peace
representatives
and
of the countries
security.
concerned by this crisis.
President, Niger remains deeply concerned
From one
by
session
the
and meeting
recent
to another,
developments.
the news reaching us
With a
from
resurgence
occupied
in
Palestinian
violence
territory
between Israel
see us
and
edging
Palestinians
further and further
the
away
outbreak
from
of
peace
inter-community
perspectives
violence in
pursuant
Israel
to the
itself.
consensus of the international community
It is
on the creation of
regrettable to note
a Palestinian
since
state
our first
living
meeting
alongside
this week, the
Israel in
situation
peace and
has
security.
deteriorated on a daily basis, bringing with
Niger
it
remains
desolation,
deeply
death
concerned
and
by
destruction
recent
in
developments
the occupied Palestinian
with a
territory
resurgence
and
in
the
violence
Gaza Strip
between Israel and
due to
Palestinians
the Israeli
and
shelling,
the outbreak
which
of
is responded
inter-community
to
violence
with
in
rocket
Israel
fire
itself.
from Palestinian militants.
It is regrettable
The incidents
to note
unleashed
that since
by the
our first
project
meeting
to
this
evict
week,
Palestinian
the
families from the
has
Sheikh Jarrah and
deteriorated
Silwan
on a daily
neighborhoods,
basis,
bringing
but
with it
also the
desolation,
Israeli
police
death
raid,
and destruction
in the Haram
in
al-Sharif
the occupied
mosque
Palestinian
during the
territory
holy
and
month
in the
of
Gaza
Ramadan
Strip last 7th
due
of May,
to the Israeli shelling,
run the risk
which
of
is
plunging the
responded
region
to
into
with
a
rocket
broader
fire
conflict.
from
Palestinian
Our
militants.
disquiet is all the greater
The
given the
incidents
risk of
unleashed
internationalization
by
of this
the
crisis,
project
to evict
which is increasingly
Palestinian
likely
families
upon the
from
basis
the
of
Sheikh Jarrah
information
and
suggesting
Silwan
imminent
neighborhoods,
ground
but
offensive
also
by
the
Israeli
Israeli
troops
police
in
raid
Gaza
in
and
the
missile
Haram
strikes
al-Sharif
from Lebanon
mosque towards
during
Israel.
the holy month of Ramadan.
To date,
Last there have
7th
been
of
over
May,
10 deaths on the
run the
Israeli
risk
side
of
and plunging the
almost
region into
140
a broader
deaths,
conflict, including
Our
39
disquiet is
children
all
and
the greater
22
given
women,
the risk of
as well
internationalization
as
of this
enormous
crisis,
material
which is
damage
increasingly
and over
likely upon the
10,000
basis of
displaced
information
persons, either
suggesting
because
the
of imminent
destruction of
ground
their homes
offensive
by
or
Israeli
simply because
troops
they
in
are
Gaza
seeking refuge
and missile
in
strikes
schools from Lebanon
refugee
towards
camps
Israel
and other
United Nations
to
premises,
date, which
there have
alas,
been over
are
10
themselves
deaths on
not
the Israeli
spared,
side
as we
and
have
almost
seen.
140 deaths, including
Civilians
39
on either
children and
side
22 women,
must be protected,
as well as enormous
irrespective of their
material
origin,
damage
race,
and over
or
10
religion,
in line with international humanitarian law and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council for their protection during conflict. The case of the airstrike in the Shati refugee camp, leading to the death of 8 Palestinian children, is simply shocking and unacceptable. My delegation calls for an immediate halt of hostilities. We deplore this violence and other violations of human rights and international humanitarian law and call for their immediate cessation. Here, as elsewhere, it is important that all those guilty of serious abuses are made answerable for their acts. President, whilst Israel and the State of Israel has rights to protect and defend itself, we must also acknowledge the same rights for Palestinians. They have been undergoing the occupation and the effects of unbridled settlement for over 54 years. We cannot keep calling for respect for human rights and international humanitarian law everywhere else and refrain from doing so when it comes to Israel. It is simply not logical for defenseless populations living under the yoke of brutal occupation to resign themselves to eternally sitting back and waiting in the face of the inertia of the international community. President, just as we cannot cure a disease by tackling its symptoms, we cannot resolve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis merely by stopping the current violence. How many times have we already done that? The real solution is to bring Israel to halt its policy of settlement in the Palestinian territories, with its share of confiscation, eviction, destruction, and bullying and humiliation of all kinds. The true solution, I say, is to have the courage to establish the conditions to allow for an independent, viable Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, living side by side with Israel and with East Jerusalem as its capital, pursuant to the relevant resolutions of this Council and the General Assembly. In this regard, we welcome the intense diplomatic efforts undertaken by the United Nations through the Special Coordinator, Mr. Tor, Wennesland, the Middle East Quartet, and other relevant stakeholders to bring an end to the hostilities and the bloodshed, so as to allow some respite for the civilians trapped in this new conflagration of violence and to relaunch the peace process. President, regarding the humanitarian situation in the occupied territories, there is a risk that the recent violence and the destruction of buildings housing public services, including schools and hospitals, could affect the provision of basic services to the people and hamper or delay the tackling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccination campaign which has begun in occupied territories. There is also a risk of an increase in the virus infection rate because the people are more concerned with ensuring their physical safety in the face of shelling than with observing the barrier measures against the spread of the virus. My delegation also calls, therefore, for an increased support to UNRWA to allow it to meet the needs of those most affected by the combat and to continue its usual assistance to the most needy in occupied territories. We call upon Israel and Egypt to open the crossing points to Gaza to allow for the delivery of emergency humanitarian aid to particularly vulnerable populations. We also welcome the excellent work done by the ICRC on the ground in the current circumstances. President, to conclude, the Security Council must show itself capable of assuming its primary responsibility, enshrined within the Charter of our organisation, by ensuring the implementation of the two-state solution pursuant to Resolution 2334. It is time to act, because if we allow for the creation of Bantustans rather than a viable, independent Palestinian state, we will have sown the seeds of the perpetuation of hatred, violence, and human suffering in this marvellous region, the cradle of the three monotheistic religions. This time, the Council is facing a true test of its credibility and authority. We must all, united, redouble our energy and imagination to support and encourage the parties to commit resolutely to the path, continue to lend our firm support to the Special Coordinator and to all the other stakeholders who are working tirelessly to advance the peace process in the Middle East.
I thank the representative of Niger. I now give the floor to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for organizing this open debate today. I also thank UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland, and all other distinguished speakers from the affected countries, including the Secretary General of the Arab League, for their contributions to today's debate. Mr. President, the painstaking quest for peace in the Middle East is gravely imperiled by the Israeli military campaign against the state of Palestine. At this critical juncture, we must show a common resolve to ease tensions and assist both Israel and the state of Palestine towards a two-state solution based on the principles of international law and parameters laid out in Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. In recent days, we have witnessed the most severe outbreak of violence since the 2014 war against Gaza. Given our responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Security Council, as a matter of principle and of morality and international law, must not remain silent on this issue. We must do all that we can in accordance with our charter mandate to find a solution to this issue, with the hopes that future generations of Palestinians and Israelis can be unshackled from this painful cycle of occupation and violence. We welcome the efforts of individual states, particularly members of the Middle East Quartet, to de-escalate tensions, and we urge all members of the international community to spare no effort to facilitate peaceful dialogue between the parties. Mr. President, we join the UN Secretary General's call for an immediate ceasefire. The recent airstrikes targeting the civilian population in the Gaza Strip, which have killed over 180 Palestinians, including children, and injured some 1,200 others, are unacceptable. St. Vincent and the Grenadines unequivocally condemns these actions, and we reiterate our call for the occupying power to cease its military aggression against Palestinians. To be sure, we also sympathize with the families of those who died in Israel. Furthermore, we believe that international law of civilians must be upheld, and that those responsible for breaches of such law should be held accountable for their crimes. The right to self-defense cannot cloak the wrongs of the party that fired the first shots and is using military capabilities far beyond that of the weaker party. Let us remember that Palestinians do not have shelters or protections to wait out the hail of airstrikes. This council is their only protection. International law is their only protection, and we are feeling them. We are alarmed by the escalating and incitement by Israeli forces on various holy sites in Jerusalem, including the al-Aqsa Mosque, al-Haram, al-Sharif compound, where hundreds of Palestinian worshippers. We call on all sides to desist from violence, incitement, and inflammatory way. We also reaffirm that Jerusalem remains the holy site of the three monotheistic religions, to be treasured by all of humanity, and we reject any unilateral attempt to change its historic status. St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains deeply concerned about the potential eviction of Palestinians from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem, including families in the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods of the city. The ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and remains a significant threat to lasting and comprehensive peace. Yet again, St. Vincent and the Grenadines calls on Israel to cease all settlement activities and to abide by its legal obligations and responsibilities under international humanitarian law and the Fourth Geneva Convention. Further, as reinforced by Resolution 2334 of 2016, we condemn all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory. The international community must be candid and upright actions. Don't the lives and dignity of Palestinians matter too? In conclusion, Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines reaffirms that an internationally agreed solution based on pre-1967 borders remains the most credible path to resolving this issue. Only through dialogue and good faith negotiations, respectful of the bedrock principles of international law, can security for all be assured, and for Palestinians, Palestinian claims to dignity, equality, and human rights be honored. The international community must deepen its commitment to take the political, diplomatic, and legal steps necessary to de-escalate tensions. The imperative is clear. We must stand together, firmly and resolutely and demand peace and justice for all. It is time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for her statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I welcome the participation of the Secretary General as well as several ministers today, and I thank the Special Coordinator for his briefing. France is extremely concerned about the spiral of violence underway in the Middle East. This is largely the result of a lack of political prospects. The suffering and violence risk continuing if the will is not there forward toward the establishment of two states living in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the lines of June 4th, 1967, both with Jerusalem as their capital within the framework of international law and the resolutions of this council. France expressed its concern very early on regarding the tensions which emerged starting in April in the Old City of Jerusalem and in Sheikh Jarrah, and the risks linked to the acceleration of settlement activity in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. Today, the ongoing escalation creates the risk of a major conflict with grave consequences in the Palestinian territories and in Israel, and with unforeseeable regional repercussions. Everything possible must be done to put an end to this. It is therefore urgent to end the hostilities immediately, as was said by the Secretary General. We're particularly worried about the high number of civilian casualties on both sides, especially children. Our thoughts today are with their families and loved ones. We strongly condemn the firing of rockets at Israel, responsibility for which has been claimed by Hamas and other terrorist groups. This is unacceptable and must stop immediately. This indiscriminate fire is contrary to international humanitarian law, and it puts the Israeli population in grave danger. And I reiterate that France will never compromise on Israel's security. France recognizes Israel's rights to self-defense, but it calls on the Israeli authorities to exercise the utmost restraint and to act in strict compliance with international law and international humanitarian law. France is gravely concerned about the fate of the civilian population in Gaza, already severely affected by the blockade. We call on all parties to ensure access to aid and to protect humanitarian and medical personnel, as well as ambulances. We support UNICEF's call to act to protect children, and we also call for the protection of journalists and for full respect of freedom of the press. The ongoing clashes in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as those in Israel, are of great concern. All provocative statements and calls to violence must stop. We call on all parties to exercise restraint. Measures to restore calm in Jerusalem must continue. This includes full respect for the 1967 status quo in the holy sites and the end of all settlement activities, including the eviction of Palestinian families from East Jerusalem, including Sheikh Jarrah, which is contrary to international humanitarian law.